so nice to meet all of you guys. I wish we could all be together in Rhinebeck, which is such an amazing place. I have fond memories of going up there when I worked for Stephen in New York City, and it's a pretty incredible place. So I hopefully once all this is over, you guys can get to experience that. But yeah, I'm excited to see what you guys are working on and excited to share a few projects today that we've been working on. So I want to thank Irene for the invitation. It's great to see you and to get to share our work. So I'm Yasmin Vobis. My office is called Ultramoderne, that I run with my partner, Erin Forrest, and we're based in Providence, Rhode Island. I've also been teaching, started out teaching at RISD, then I was commuting to New York, teaching at Cooper Union, and now I'm going to start a new teaching job at the GSD in the fall. But we really started, yay, we really started our office in earnest after New York City in 2014, and when we started teaching. And I would say that with our work, we've really tried to think about this dialogue between questions of abstraction on the one hand, and maybe issues of material and social impact on the other. And if we, if I was pinned down and if I had to say if we specialize in anything, it's really commitment to public architecture. And so we've been trying to see if there's another way to maybe to think about architecture, maybe more as an act of clearing, or trying to prepare a field for something yet to come. And so that's the title of the lecture also, formats. And in this context, the media through which we tackle these questions become very important. We make a lot of physical models as a way of initially testing material and organization at the same time. And we like that because it allows us to really think about how things are structured literally, but also maybe socially. This is us. We make a lot of full-scale tests and mock-ups as a way also to try and absorb things into architecture that typically resist it. And then just for context, this is our little state of Rhode Island, and then Providence is a small city of 250,000 people, located at the kind of tip of Narragansett Bay in the northeast corner of the state. And what's kind of been fun about working in Providence is that it's so small that there is this sense that whatever you do in one location can have a larger impact across the city or even the state, because everything is so small and connected. But I think to kind of flesh out the theme of the talk a little bit, I'll start out by talking about two publications that we put together recently. The first one was for the Seoul Architecture Biennial last year, which is called Vacant Providence, the publication. And it was really this little survey of modern architecture in Providence, focusing on works that sprang out of vacant space and other kind of not so great real estate conditions. And we were initially invited to do this project, because of this pavilion that we made in Providence. And the curators kind of asked us to extrapolate from this project to talk about urbanism of a city like Providence. And as far as this is a kind of an interesting prompt, and I think this is, I'm sure, something you guys might be talking a lot about too, working with Stephen, is just how does architecture really have an urban impact, and how do those two things really speak to one another? The site for the pavilion was actually this kind of not so, this parking lot, this really like massive parking lot behind the cultural center and Trinity Church in here. That the church and the cultural center had already been using this parking lot for a long time for kind of summertime activities, but it's one of these like vast empty voids really in one of the densest parts of the city. And this prompted us to kind of zoom out a little bit and look at Providence as a whole and start to map just the kind of sheer number of parking lots in the city, these kind of like, islands, these voids in the city. And there's quite a few, and it's brought into maybe even deeper relief if you think about just the kind of, if you compare to the amount of green space in the city, which is not much. And so there's, you know, making these maps, we really started to understand that there's really just a lot more area devoted to cars than maybe to people at this point in our city. And in the downtown as well, you get a lot of these parking lots, this kind of junk space that has really supplanted the built fabric of the city. And you know, you can think about these kind of voids in the city as a purely negative condition, but you know, you can say that the car has ruined Providence, but we're also interested in thinking about how this kind of abundance of vacant land in our city is maybe also an opportunity to redefine that city one lot at a time. So it gives you a kind of space and freedom maybe to experiment with alternative models, you know, models that aren't just for profit, but that are maybe true alternatives to what happens. So we can then start to see each one of these voids as an opportunity to try to build the city differently. And you know, for this publication, we started to look for recent examples where a piece of architecture had taken on an underutilized plot of land to propose a kind of different way of inhabiting the city. So what resulted were these 10 pamphlets, each looking at an individual building or design from the past 60 years. And we were really interested in finding projects that were kind of strong pieces of architecture that had an urban proposition, and also that wouldn't follow a kind of typical development model. And interestingly, I think we learned a lot about our city. You know, there's a lot of examples. Some are by famous architects, but some are but the projects may be relatively unknown. Others are by local architects or artists that worked with the circumstances to try to do something different. And you can see here, this is just a short, like maybe a snapshot of some of the architects included. So some you may recognize, some you may not, and a few of the projects that we photographed and kind of drew through. So to tie everything together, we looked into a longer history of the kind of emptiness in the city, looking back to its founding in the 17th century, and also exploring how vacancy has kind of been leveraged at key moments in the city's development. And what was interesting about putting this together was realizing just how much of the city's development was driven by a demand for emptiness, as opposed to kind of dense infill. So the city's economy has been based on voids of one form or another. And you know, what's interesting also is that each one of these historical epochs has its own maybe architectural experiment. We took as our prototype this Providence Arcade. That's a building that's downtown, which adapted the Greek temple to a kind of commercial use, you know, filling the space between two streets with a new type of program for the 19th century, so the kind of indoor shopping mall. And the interior is again an articulation of a void, a kind of 3-story void devoted to consumerism. And so this publication goes through 10 of these projects from the 1960s to the present, you know, some that kind of leveraged car culture to propose different forms of urbanity. So the first one of these is Cathedral Square by MP. This is a small church by Eric Katansky on the west side. And it keeps going. A Walter Gropius project called Classical High School. So it's interesting, you see all of these kind of maybe more well-known names, but doing these projects in Providence that no one has ever heard of. And so we think it's a good thing, that is, we think of it as a place to kind of experiment with things. So it's a speculative proposal by Machado Salvetti, Friedrich San Florian, a house, a project for affordable housing by some friends, Persich and Persich. And then the second essay that I think frames this lecture is this essay called Post-Typical that we wrote for the Rice Journal Platt. And it builds on the kind of Rem Koolhaas essay, Typical Plan, you know, where he kind of critiques but also valorizes the kind of commercial high-rises of Midtown Manhattan as spaces that are both, you know, mind-numbingly generic, but also kind of latent with opportunity. So we thought this might be a good lens through which to look at the plans of our own projects, which are often just these big empty rectangles that are left intentionally blank as a way of kind of opening up the possibilities of what might happen within. So Koolhaas kind of likened the typical plan of architecture to graph paper, which I think was meant to be an insult, but we found to be an exciting possibility. You know, that perhaps our job as architects is to kind of design new forms of architectural graph paper in order to insinuate rather than kind of insist upon new ways of living and interacting with each other. So here you see a number of our plans to think, you know, that start to think through this idea of an almost empty architecture. And an architecture that could be kind of relaxed but assertive at the same time, that despite the kind of plainness and the origin, you know, despite the plainness and the kind of origin of its plan, would nevertheless hold kind of rich implications for an atmosphere that gets constructed within. So these two publications, I think, taken together, can perhaps be best read as a way of thinking about emptiness, whether in the city or in the design of a building, as something that's kind of ripe with possibility, that the boundary of a parking lot or the perimeter of a building can really start to have implications for what happens inside, but that the relationship between them isn't so direct. So with all this in mind, we've begun to think of architecture as a kind of format, like a sheet of letter-size paper. It's a kind of blank framework for multiplicity and simultaneity of actions that maybe aren't predetermined by the architecture, but that are instigated and kind of inflected by it instead. You know, I've been kind of showing you a couple of snapshots of projects, but for the rest of the lecture, I'm going to zero in on just a few of these architectural formats in a bit more detail to show maybe how this idea might be constructed. So the first two are related. They're both projects that explore mass timber, and that's kind of how I think the office got its start. So wood, as I'm sure you guys know, is renewable and sequesters carbon when responsibly managed. And so it's had a lot of attention on it recently as being a kind of more sustainable replacement for concrete and steel. But I think aside from the sustainability argument, I think what's interesting about mass timber is that it's really a new building material, and new building materials don't come along that often. And so I think it's exciting to start to think about, you know, how can a new building material produce new forms of space and structure. So when we think back maybe to the 20th century with the invention of steel and reinforced concrete and the kind of incredible architectural response that came to from these materials, we think that mass timber still has the potential to be, you know, to kind of rethink and shake up architecture a little bit. And so, you know, currently I think we see a lot of mass timber projects where it's being used in mundane ways as a kind of direct replacement for precast concrete planks. And so it still hasn't had its kind of maison domino moment, you know, the moment when a new building material kind of crystallizes into a new spatial and structural expression. So we think wood is kind of familiar, but I would say mass timber is a different beast. You know, the fact is that these new materials are very strong, and because they're glued up, they can potentially, you know, operate at a much larger scale than traditional timber. And we are excited about that because I think it opens up new opportunities for architecture that can address a larger audience or larger groups of people, larger buildings as well, much larger than we typically think of with wood. So through a series of projects, we've kind of been experimenting with mass timber, and I'll show you a couple of these. So the first is a project called Four Corners, which is an installation for the Boston Society of Architects. And we started out the project by researching kind of traditional New England timber construction, and in particular, these very large barns. And the way that they're typically made is that there's this thing called a timber bent, which is this kind of frame, a kind of two-dimensional frame which is a structural frame, and that kind of marches along in a very linear fashion to produce both the space and the structure of the project. And so thinking about how do you translate something like that into a planar material, we had to kind of reimagine the timber bent as something more three-dimensional that could be taken apart and rearranged. And so in a planar material, we started to think about the timber bent as really more of like a three-dimensional kind of folded plate structure. And here's just a photograph of the installation, and it refers back to this image of the wood gables, but it's really, if you start to think about the kind of structural system, it's really kind of a different proposal. The CLT was fabricated in northern Quebec and then assembled by a small team over 3 days. And as you guys know, CLT is essentially like very large scale plywood. It comes in sheets, and so a lot of the planning of the installation has to do with just minimizing waste and also thinking through the assembly of this global project, which was going to be by us. And so all the pieces had to be small enough that we could carry them by hand, and to make sure that they would come together in a very kind of clean fit. The other thing we tried to do was to really minimize just the visibility of the fasteners, so the screws or the kind of heavy metal connection plates that you often see with mass timber, so that you could really express the CLT as both the structure and the finish of the project, and to give it a kind of abstraction that's different than the kind of traditional tectonics of working in timber. So this is kind of an early attempt at working with this material. But what's interesting is I feel like it really opened up our eyes to what was possible with mass timber, and it allowed us to kind of take a leap in the next project. So this project is a lakefront kiosk that was designed for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. We began the project by looking at these two kind of Chicago archetypes. On the one hand, Mises experiments in kind of suspended, flat, clear span roofs, like at IIT. And then on the right, Eames's kind of playful explorations of scale in their film, The Powers of 10, which was actually filmed on the Chicago shore, which was the site for the project. What we like about the film is that it asks this very fundamental question of kind of what happens to our understanding of something as we jump in scale. And so we were kind of wrapping our heads around this question because the competition brief asked for a very small kiosk of 200 square feet. But we were interested in thinking about how do you try to make something larger, something more generous, something that could maybe speak to more of an urban scale, something that maybe could be more of a space rather than this kind of small object. And so we started to think about this kind of very large roof plane under which many different things might happen. And so because we're jumping in scale, we thought the project would be made up of just a few kind of key ingredients, kind of maximum roof, some columns, and then a kind of leisurely public that might come to inhabit it. So here's the plan. So in order to do this, we had to keep everything just super simple. To give you guys a sense, the brief actually called for a project that was about the size of the space labeled as vendor in this drawing that you're looking at. And so in order to kind of make something that much larger, everything had to be really pared down and kind of simplified. But I think what was exciting to us is thinking about this pavilion as something that would kind of dissolve the boundary between the kiosk and the city, right? It's just this large roof plane that might invite the city and its activities into it, where you might exchange ideas, food, or books. And we also thought that this kind of simplicity of the roof plane could produce a kind of varied experience. So when you're below, it might frame the flat horizon of Lake Michigan beyond, and you might ascend a set of stairs where the kind of abstract plane of the roof might frame the skyline beyond. Now, the strange thing about building a pavilion in wood is the more wood that you use, the more carbon you sequester, which can kind of strangely lead to what they call a carbon negative project. And while that logic is a little bit specious, we were interested in this because the dialogue around sustainability tends to force everyone to kind of talk about, it forces a conversation about scarcity, about kind of doing less bad when you do a project. And mass timber, I think, is interesting in the sense that it allows us, again, to think of architecture in terms of maybe a potential generosity in a way that might respond to our contemporary social condition. But to maximize the dimensions of the project, we work with, kind of relatively cheap industrial materials. So structural wood on the one hand and chain link fence, but with the idea of using them in ways that you might not normally see them. So everything in the project had to do double duty. It had to be kind of both the structure and the finish. So the ceiling you see here is cross-laminated timber planks laid up without any beams. And what's maybe unusual about this way of using mass timber is that we're thinking about the roof plane as a kind of flat plate, just like in concrete. So there's no beams, it's just a kind of singular flat plate spanning in two directions, which seems like a very simple idea, and I think we were very innocent proposing that in the competition, but then actually figuring out how to do that technically was very challenging, I think, especially for our structural engineer. We worked with our friend over at Guy Nordensen's office, Brett Schneider, and he really figured out how to do this. How do you make a flat plate out of wood by basically laminating sheets of CLT in two directions and then stitching them together so that these two layers really function as one. We were also thinking very carefully through the erection sequence of the project. And since we had been kind of looking at Mies van der Rohe and we're really enamored by his new National Gallery, we thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could just lift the entire roof up on the columns? Which is actually, it turns out, how they wanted to build it. When we worked with the contractor for safety reasons, it was actually better to build the roof down on the ground and then to lift it up along the columns. And it also, thinking about that led to details such as this, where there's a column capital, but it's actually ends up on top of the roof plate. And so the roof is actually hung from the columns. And what that allows you to do is it keeps the kind of underside of the roof really free of any kind of connection details. You can kind of see that here. The other material that I mentioned is the chain link that kind of wraps these two lightweight volumes underneath. And what's interesting actually about chain link is actually invented by a textile manufacturer. And so it's really like, if you've ever seen chain link that isn't kind of installed, it's really like a fabric, it's floppy. It has to be kind of tensioned into place. And so in this case, we were tensioning it vertically from the roof down to the ground. And what that kind of allows you to do is to have these very open corners because you don't have kind of intermediate structure at those moments. Here's just a view from the roof back on the city. And then the other thing we started to think about was, how do you kind of extend the life of a space like this, which is meant to be public? How do you kind of extend that into the evening hours? And so we developed a lighting installation at the two volumes underneath the roof that would play with two sets of LEDs. One that's a kind of warmer color, like moonlight, and the other that's a kind of cooler color, like daylight. So playing with just these kind of color temperatures of LED lights. And then that these two would have a kind of alternating sequence, moving from the early evening and into the night. Let me see that installed here. But I think the combination of all these factors, I think what was interesting to us about the project was just starting with a kind of competition model and then trying to kind of build that model in a very kind of direct way and stay faithful to the kind of innocence of that model. And so how do you detail something to look like a physical model? How do you kind of retain that type of abstraction? And And here's just one last view of it. The next project was not built. It's a competition entry for MoMA PS1's Young Architects program. And this project is really about the kind of inscription of a new boundary in the space. And so how do you delineate a simple figure as a way to kind of redefine that space and to kind of frame something where, you know, because of that difference and because of that separation, there's the kind of possibility for difference. The archetype maybe for this type of approach is the schoolyard. You know, it's the space that is adjacent to the school, but it's at the same time distinct. It's a space that creates the necessary conditions for play, where students can get into a little bit of mischief and in that sense kind of reinvent the rules that can then be brought back inside the school and to the city outside. And so we were hoping that the PS1 courtyard could again function in that way, so that it's doesn't feel like it's part of the formal galleries, but it's really the space for recess. So we proposed a kind of simple circle, a pure circle kind of inscribed in the triangular courtyard. And it's really, you know, about kind of defining a very airy boundary, a kind of very large volume with very, very little mass. That would frame a space for participation. So as you can see in the plan, the volume would fill the courtyard and would ask, you know, as you're entering the museum to kind of pass through this volume, you know, on your way to see a gallery show or a music event. So it's something that has to be kind of negotiated and moved through. We were also proposing that this would be quite large, that the volume would rise to a height of 50 feet. And then start to screen the surrounding context with a kind of porous veil. And again, for the veil, we had just finished Chicago when we were working on this, and so we were kind of, chain link was on our mind, and we started doing a few tests, which didn't work, and we'd have to redefine it. So we realized very quickly that we needed a kind of more robust structural system, and we worked again with Brett Schneider to kind of think through a way to support this lightweight veil through a kind of mass timber structure. So the structure is really, I guess, a little bit like an inverted bicycle wheel in the sense that you have a series of canted columns that push up from the ground and then a tension ring around the top, and then the chain link would pull everything down like a kind of tension membrane all around. These are just Brett's analyses. And then the other thing we were thinking about, you know, PS1 is this kind of, has had many, many installations in it over the years. And so the ground is littered with foundations of other installations. And so how do you propose a project that has a certain amount of flexibility built into it, so that when you get to the site and you find something that you're able to, that there's some flexibility in your project so that you're not tied to specific locations on the ground. So we had this idea of a series of columns that are different lengths that could then, you know, be situated in such a way to avoid anything that we would find on the site. But we also like that these different lengths introduced some spatial variation in the project. So this idea of this kind of new interior that would be a flexible space that would encourage different types of play. Anything from, you know, being able to kind of envelop these large musical performances, but also maybe thinking about ways that people might use the specific geometry of the space to invent different types of games. And so I think, you know, we think a lot about this question of flexibility in our projects, and I think we look a lot to modernist responses to this question of flexibility. I mean, Mises is this idea of a kind of universal space. But I think we're interested in that, you know, the space isn't completely neutral, but that there are some elements in there, that there is a subtle order that allows people to kind of engage and experiment with those relationships. just imagining what this might look like with during the summer warm-ups. And then for the membrane itself, we were thinking about a kind of double layer system. So one that's a kind of cylinder on the outside that's just the galvanized chain link, and then on the inside a kind of golden finish that has a little bit more of a playful figure on the inside, and you see that in this drawing, the way that these two layers would interact. I think what's fun is that even a kind of simple projection of the two layers, you start to have these visual effects. And yeah, the other idea was that it would also start to provide some of the shade during the hot summer days. We thought a little bit through, again, I think, you know, we like to think very directly about the pragmatics of a project and how it would be constructed and how that becomes part of the architectural idea. So here we were thinking about the installation as just a very simple kit of parts, you know, the kind of mass timber frame, and then these kind of chain link pieces where everything could start on the ground and then actually be kind of lifted up by a crane. So that the construction, you know, we start to think about the construction as a kind of spectacle as well. Just, can you guys hear the video? Or do I need to turn it up? We can hear it.
We can hear it, but we can hear it.
I can hear it.
Okay. So this was just a little video we made for the project where we were actually just trying to kind of inscribe some of the geometries at a slightly smaller scale in one of these empty parking lots in Providence to kind of test it out. Okay. So the next project is not a wood project, but I think it continues some of the kind of material experimentation in relation to thinking about this kind of open format for activities. So this one is called Tables Clear, and it was an installation for the Architectural League of New York's Beaux-Arts Ball that they hold every year. And this was the site. So the annual ball was going to be held in a warehouse in Greenpoint that was in the middle of undergoing renovation. And you can kind of see the active construction site here. And this was, you know, only a few weeks before the event was to take place. And that year's theme was tabula rasa. And so keeping the kind of messiness of the site in mind, we started to think about tablecloths and the way that they kind of create a new surface for an event to take place. And so we came across these images of the tablecloth trick being performed by Frank Sinatra. And they're very funny in the sense that, you know, the trick fails him, and in an act of frustration, he kind of throws the tablecloth up in the air But we love the photograph because, you know, the tablecloth is now all of a sudden free from the table and is kind of floating and falling at the same time. It's a kind of in-between state. And so we began the project by making these rather naive models to think about how to maybe drape a very large textile to mask the industrial warehouse, where, you know, these monumental voids cut into the fabric would lightly define rooms within the larger space. And they would also be the kind of mechanism that would allow people to pass through the kind of low-hanging fabric. I think the other piece of this is that, or the other piece of background you might need to know is that this was a kind of one-day project, and so the installation would happen the day before the event, and then it would get taken down the day after the event. And so we were interested in doing something extremely lightweight. And so while this is actually a pretty rather large piece of textile, it's actually just really lightweight and can be kind of packed away. But the innocence, let's say, of the early models, interestingly gave way to a host of kind of technical issues. So one of the trickiest things about this project was, how do you accurately predict the behavior of such a large piece of textile? We knew from slightly larger physical models that once you start cutting these very large holes in a piece of fabric, the fabric wants to distort and wrinkle. And so we also, in conjunction with the physical model, started to make a kind of digital simulation grasshopper with advice from our structural engineer to maybe start to predict how the wrinkles would happen and what we might do to anticipate them and to kind of prevent them. So this is our kind of first version. The black is the kind of idealized shape, and the blue is the kind of distorted shape, just when you kind of let the textile relax with gravity. So you can see there's a lot of sags and wrinkles in there. And then through a series of iterations, we realized that if you turn the two short edges into arcs, and you also started to kind of put a tension element around each one of the openings, you could start to control the geometry quite a bit more. And you can see that in the section as well. So the earlier ones obviously distorted a lot more than some of the later ones. And here I am adding one of these tension elements. The other thing about the project is that, you know, it was going to be fabricated by seamstresses at a kind of theater curtain shop. And so we tried to keep the geometry kind of necessarily rational and simple to lay out. So just circles, straight lines, and arcs. Because this is how they make these things, right? It's like, it's a pretty crazy process of working on such a massive piece of fabric. So the hope was that this kind of complexity to the form comes from, rather than a kind of like drawing that's complex, that it comes from this interaction between the material and gravity. And I think for us, I think maybe the most interesting thing about the project is actually the process, and how do you start to fold other materials into architecture that typically aren't part of our repertoire, or that typically, you know, people would shy away from because they are harder to predict, or they're not things that we typically build with. And then the final project I'd like to show, you know, takes maybe this idea to more of an urban condition. So this is the pavilion that I mentioned earlier. And this was a design build project that we did on the south side of Providence called SOUTHLIGHT. And it was a collaboration actually with our students and colleagues at RISD, the city of Providence, and the neighborhood cultural center called the Southside Cultural Center. And I think maybe what was interesting here is that the project really had to do a lot on a really, really small budget. And it was also an interesting process where faculty and students worked with the community to design a new public space and performance pavilion that would then actually be built by the students and by us over the course of one summer. So again, you know, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a kind of map of Providence, and this kind of steady growth of parking lots that has kind of taken over our city. This project in particular takes over one of those parking lots here on the south side. And this is the site. So there's the SOUTHLIGHT Cultural Center, which is a bit of an anchor in the neighborhood. It's an interesting organization. They do a lot of programming for the diverse communities of our city. And then there's the Trinity Church, which is a kind of historically Black church in the neighborhood. And they had this massive massive parking lot out in the back. And looking into the zoning for the site, it actually turned out that we could reduce the parking requirements for the building in half. And so the proposal was to take over a piece of the parking lot to connect two of the streets and to add a small performance pavilion. Because like I said, the cultural center was already using this parking lot for a number of activities. This was a way of kind of formalizing it and making that space more hospitable, more comfortable, and usable for them. So the proposal was just this very simple green band that cuts across the existing parking lot, as a kind of project that's doable over the course of one summer with a set of students. But at the heart of this landscape is this little performance pavilion that has the ability to kind of open up in all directions, and that can be used, for performances, for markets. And again, because we had a very small budget and we were working with students, we thought that maybe one way to approach the project was to work with a kind of standardized greenhouse kit, but to make a series of kind of modifications. So the first modification was to flip the roof trusses upside down, which is kind of structurally not significant because the truss still works in the same way. But of course, architecturally, it means that all of a sudden you don't have a building that has a kind of house-shaped profile, but that maybe has a kind of more abstract exterior, and maybe that could feel a little bit more like a building with some civic presence. And you can kind of see that here with the flipped roof trusses and the kind of exposed structure on the interior. And then given the cultural center's ambition to host many different types of cultural programs, the architecture really needed to be incredibly flexible and open. And so the other modification we made to the greenhouse was to fabricate a series of doors that could open up in all directions. You see that here. And so here are the kind of large doors lining the perimeter, and then here as they open up. And then here it is in use. And again, the landscape would also start to be able to accommodate these larger gatherings. The building is lit up at night by a series of fluorescents. And so it gives also the cultural center a kind of presence, maybe that it didn't have before, something that people would notice in the neighborhood. And here's just one last photo of that. And then as a kind of postscript to this project, we're now actually working on the renovation of the main building of the SOUTHLIGHT Cultural Center, which is the building you kind of see on the right. So adding a kind of new entrance and making it more accessible. And but it's a project that's really close to our heart and that we're very excited about, because it's really, this question of how do we build a community center and an arts organization in the 21st century? What does that mean now? Especially now with 2020 and everything that's happened this year, I think buildings and organizations like this obviously have a much more critical role and need some kind of architectural invention to speak to that. And I just want to end on this image because this is actually, it's a funny way to end a lecture because it's actually the first project we ever did, and it's a series of images of Bryant Park. Taken by a webcam, and we were taking images of Bryant Park every 10 minutes, every day for a full year, and then we averaged them together into this image. And I think what we really like as a result is that you see how activities and people kind of blur together over time, and only the kind of relative frame, the kind of relative permanence of the frame is what holds this kind of public space together. So it really made us think about architecture as a way of framing things, as a kind of format for actions, as a way to embrace multiple timescales and multiple publics. So yeah, that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you guys want to see anything in more detail, just let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. This was very provoking, thought-provoking, also very exciting to see really the integration of structural systems and how you can really draw inspiration from detailing. Very, very, very beautiful work. I love how you engage public space, how the simplicity of the gesture, the format, as you have been discussing, really frames the activities, is a framework for activity, and it plays with light, natural light, artificial light. The lightness of the form is quite beautiful, and how difficult in fact it is to deal with it. So there's a lot of inversions here that are very surprising and really inspiring.
I like that word, inversions. I hadn't thought about that, but I like that.
I'd like to welcome everyone to use the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen if you haven't seen this, or if you're new to the webinar function. I hope my sound is a little bit more stable now. And for our residents, feel free to unmute and have a conversation.
Hi, Yasmin. Thank you for that presentation. It's actually kind of interesting. For me, coming from Houston, also has a lot of vacant spaces, mostly a lot of parking spaces. And what's interesting about the current conditions of the country we're in, you know, because of the pandemic, a lot of spaces needed to be adapted, readapted for specific needs. Some of your projects are made out of a few kit of parts almost, and it's very simple, and it almost seems like it could be possible to reuse those kit of parts for a different site or different function. Is that something you've been thinking about? Is that something that came up during your experimentations?
Yeah, it is something we have been thinking about. It's hard to do. We ran into this problem. For example, the first installation that I showed, that's just made up of all these little pieces. We had that project in storage for a number of years, and finding a new site for it has been very difficult. And so in some ways, storage is actually the biggest problem. We're paying for that storage, but I like the idea that you could start to detail things in such a way that they can be taken apart. I mean, this happens a lot, actually happens a lot with old industrial buildings where pieces get reused. So I think would be very important to think about that. And maybe in an interesting way, it forces a very elemental way of thinking about the architecture, like just as a series of pieces that don't have a bunch of stuff kind of cladding or other things kind of over the bones, but that you might be, you might really think about how those bones might be reused in some way. I like that idea a lot. Yeah. And maybe a different way of thinking about flexibility. I mean, not just in the kind of reuse of a space, but that the space actually moves somewhere else. There's a project, I'm trying to remember, I don't know if you guys ever saw this little pavilion by Atelier Bow Wow. It was in Manhattan, the kind of BMW Guggenheim lab. But it was this carbon fiber structure that was very interesting. That the idea was actually that you could take it apart and it would kind of get moved to a new location and host a series of events. I should look it up.
Thinking about maybe a little bit more about the public space and how the architecture invites people to form different groups of different sizes, maybe, and gatherings. And I noticed like how incredibly detailed those furniture models is that you're making with, it seems with incredible care. And I was wondering to what extent the furnishing or the small scale interventions that you use, how you use that to activate engagement in public spaces.
Yeah, I think those pieces end up being fairly important. I mean, I think because they kind of instigate a particular use. It's the kind of thing that you don't have so much control over, because people can take furniture away, it can get lost, it can get destroyed. And so I think for us, most of the effort is really in the kind of infrastructure, or the, defining the elements that will not move, and defining those elements in such a way that they are, as, allow for as flexible use as possible. But I agree with you that the furniture is actually key in kind of inviting people into the space, making them feel welcome, making them feel comfortable in that space. And I mean, it's definitely something we would love to work on more in thinking about these smaller scale pieces, how they might fit together, or what might be unusual about them, right?
I see there is, go ahead, Munjay.
Sorry. For public projects, essentially, there are a different set of constraints sometimes, and sometimes it's mostly financial constraints. And as designers, we kind of have to innovate through different avenues to kind of bring more value to projects. Oftentimes it's through graphical interventions, or even just the simple use of materials in a different way. How do you prioritize certain aspects of bringing value to a project?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I would say that in our approach, we've tried to maximize usable space. Let's say that's been the kind of approach in a lot of the projects, and to make it as flexible as possible. I agree with you, this idea of using materials that are cheap and that can do many things at once has also been a strategy in order to kind of try and keep costs down, and in order to kind of maximize the space of a project. I think, yeah, I mean, I think this approach to material is actually very important, because you can spend a lot of money on some really sumptuous, beautiful materials, but in the end, if it only gets you a small, I don't know, a few square feet of space, then it might not be worth it. So I think I agree, especially in public space, how do we think about materials that are resilient in many different ways, that are both tough and frame a space, kind of direct a space, but also are, in many cases, industrial, right? They're not kind of handmade materials. They can speak to that scale of a public space. Remind me, is there the project that you guys are working on, there is a public space component to it, right? Or it's...
There's a public education museum component to the project.
Nice.
I saw that a person from the audience was raising their hand. You can do that digitally. And please, you can chat or ask the question. If this was an accident, I understand, but if you still need to talk, and I would like to invite you to do that. So in the meantime, Christopher Pichusemi is saying, thank you for the very eloquent and enthusiastic presentation. In addition to the spectacle of the assembly, your projects offer to the public a readable assembly and the form, and even drafted onto the pavement of the parking lot. Your firm says to target competitions to explore these ideas. Are there any competitions you're working on during quarantine? Do they utilize moonlight versus daylight as the Chicago project? Thanks again. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a tough question, because we are working on competitions that I cannot talk about. We usually do try to have 1 or 2 competitions a year that we work through. I mean, we really actually enjoy the format, because it's a chance to, it's different than kind of working with the client right away, which is also a good process. But I think the chance of a competition is that you get to kind of think outside the box a little bit and try to kind of explore something. And the approach we take, you know, we also lose a lot of competitions. And so the approach we usually take is that we try to do a project that we really like ourselves, that we think is important, that's worth our time. And then if we lose, it's okay. Yeah.
Yasmin, what would be maybe your message for young professionals or students today? I mean, given those difficult circumstances, choose competitions, work selectively on competitions, build up a body of work that represents your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I would say, yeah, all of those things. I mean, one thing we tried to do early on with the competitions is that we tended to look for competitions where something would get built. That was very important for us, so that we would, you know, try our hand at things and be able to try things out. Because it's very hard as a young architect. You know, you might work in other offices or for other people for a while, but no one will trust you to do anything unless you can show that you've built some things. And so competitions are a really great way to try and test something and to build up your portfolio, as you're saying. I think it's also important to, and I don't know that this is something that you can always do in advance, is to build up a project for yourself. I mean, I feel like we didn't start our office with like a particular project in mind and then decided to do a series of projects that would elaborate that project. I think instead we just started doing projects, and just through that work you start to develop a larger project for yourself, and it can take you in places that maybe aren't entirely expected. I think for us, for example, you know, we started teaching at RISD, and that had a huge influence on the way that we work and think about things. RISD is very hands-on, and I think that shaped our approach a lot, working with RISD students, actually.
Thank you. Yes, and you will have a chance to talk with the residents further today and look at their works and spend some time with them individually. So I would like to thank you. It's already past noon, so we have concluded on time, and I think this has been really great. Thank you very, very much.